Okay.
All right. Hi, and welcome everyone to this session. We're so happy you could join us today on this Tuesday afternoon. Uh, as you're here in the right place, we're talking about maintaining instructional rigor and how we support small groups in distance learning. So we'll start today with some introductions about who's on camera here with you today before we get into the meat of the learning itself. I am Randall Lober, Senior Instructional Specialist with IRRE. My job is thinking with instructional leaders at all levels and individual teachers to help them think about doing good things even better. So we engage in a lot of that thought partner work. We provide a lot of professional learning supports to really help everyone make their student outcomes move in the right direction at the right pace. And with me today is Dr. Anissa Collins, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. We're glad you're here. As Randy said, I'm Anissa Collins. I'm the Director of Instructional Supports here at IRE, and just celebrated my 11-year work anniversary. So I cannot believe that I'm helping support IRE and teachers that long. Prior to that, I was an administrator and teacher, and so I'm just very glad to be a coach and able to be with you guys this afternoon.
Thank you. And please feel free to tell us a little bit more about who else is in the room and drop some your name and location in the chat. We're always happy to know more about who is here with us. So please feel free to do so. While you're introducing yourselves, we'll talk about some of our objectives here for today and what we're hoping to accomplish by the end of our time together. First, we want to be able to develop or refine an understanding of rigor in the classroom. For those of you that are familiar with our work and have worked with us either in the past or are currently working with us, you're probably pretty familiar with our conceptualization of rigor, but we want to make sure that everyone has the benefit of that knowledge as well. We'll also talk about how small group instruction can increase rigor in the classroom as we defined it in that discussion in a few moments. And then we'll identify some strategies for facilitating that small group instruction during distance learning and what it takes to get that done in a real practical sense. We have some ground rules that govern our webinars and all of our professional learning. This particular webinar, we've identified these ground rules we'd ask you all to adhere to. First, we'll begin and end on time. So we begin right here at 3:30. And we'll end as close to 4:30 as we can, if not a little sooner, to give you back a little bit of time of your busy afternoons. Please stay focused within the chat. We know that, especially throughout the chat, lots of ideas come up, and actually we're going to encourage you to use the chat here in a moment, but please make sure that that conversation is germane to the topic at hand to really make sure that everyone gets the most out of learning opportunity we have together this afternoon. Please be respectful and assume positive intent of those that you're communicating with. We're all here bringing our individual truths, our individual stories and experiences to this hour together. And we also all know that we have our own learning that we're bringing to the table. And nobody's coming here, right, to get worse at teaching, hopefully, right? We're all around the table here and around our monitors, as it were, to think about some different ways to improve our craft. So when we hear people communicating, well, let's assume that positive intent, or when we see people communicating in chat, let's assume that positive intent behind them as well. Please use the chat feature for questions and responses. If we don't see you right away, feel free to use the raise hand feature within Zoom, and we'll acknowledge you as soon as we can. And because we're in a webinar, you don't have a choice, but we will say it anyway. Mute your microphone when not speaking. But that's also a good reminder for my co-panelist as well. Sometimes her dogs would like to speak to us. So there's that. There's some more housekeeping to attend to. As I mentioned, please do share those questions and ideas in the chat. Those back channel conversations are a powerful learning tool for us to give some more clarity and for you to achieve some more clarity as you discuss some of the points that come up. We will track and respond to questions at a logical pausing point. There's a few breaks in the session where we'll have a chance to go back and say, hey, there's a question out there, let's deal with that. We also have a Q&A session near the end lined up. And if we can't handle it within the session, we'll definitely make sure to follow up with you as part of our commitment to you as learners. And just as for forewarning, we are saving the chat, and that allows us to perform that follow-up a little bit later on, and allows us to compile any additional resources that you share for their distribution. So if someone says, here's a great randomizer for student groupings or something else, and that we link in the chat, we'll look to the chat, we'll look to some of those resources and make sure that everyone can benefit from that knowledge that you are sharing in the chat. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and start with the session itself. I will begin today with a little bit of warm-up prompt that will ask you to stop and jot a little bit, thinking on your notebooks or wherever it is you have to jot, or maybe just keep some thinking in your brain in response to this prompt. As you reflect on the distance and hybrid learning opportunities you've designed at this point in the year, what role has small group instruction played in those opportunities? Take a few moments to think about how you might respond to that question. And we know for some of you that small group of instruction may be playing a large role, where that question is kind of a no-brainer, saying it happens all the time and we do that. Some of you might be going, I really like to do that, but geez, I really don't know how to do that here in this context that we find ourselves in. And some of you might be somewhere in the middle of that continuum, and that's okay too. But it's an important thing that we want to bring attention to, and just make sure that's what we're thinking about as we get into today's session. So as we refer back to our outcomes from earlier, we wanted to start by defining rigor. As we at IRE have come to understand it in our research and experience in the field. And we think that's an important place to start, because for as many educators as we have in the room, there's probably at least as many definitions of rigor or understandings of it in the room. So we want to make sure that we're all on the same page, but B, it also really frames a lot of the work and thinking we're going to offer around small group thinking. Anissa, I see you're unmuted, so please go ahead and share what you're thinking before we go forward.
I just figured while you were skipping through the slide to the next one. Yeah, I actually did that, Randy, with a faculty of mine when I was an administrator, and I did actually have that in the room. Yes, so it is true that if you ask everybody to define rigor, you will get that many responses. I just wanted to test it out, and that's what happened.
Right, it's a word that gets thrown a lot in our field. It gets thrown around a lot in our field. And there's probably lots of variations about what we mean by that. So that's really illustrates the importance of what we're about to do here, which is hone in on the definition as we as a team have come to understand it. So the definition that we share here is borne out by some independent research that has been done on the work that we do. And it's also borne out and foundational in our engagement, alignment, rigor classroom visit tool that helps build some of that common lens and language for folks who work with us. So the definition reads as follows. Learning materials and strategies use, challenge and encourage all students to produce work or respond at or above grade level or at or above the IEP designated level. All students are required to demonstrate mastery at these levels and have the opportunity for reteaching to mastery. So we want to take a moment to really, we know there's a lot of educationese. I want to take a moment to highlight some of the key parts of that definition. First, that whole first sentence about learning materials and strategies are really about the expectations we have for students. Are they high, clear, and fair? Are we asking students to work at grade level, whatever, or IEP appropriate level? Are those expectations clear for both us and students? Are they fair expectations for where our students should be performing at? As we move in the latter parts of the definition, when we're talking about demonstrating mastery, we're talking about that formative assessment cycle. How do we know what students know? How do we know whether or not their current knowledge, skills, and abilities meet those high, clear, and fair expectations that we just talked about? And also, as we talk about mastery at these, demonstrating mastery at the levels and having opportunities for reteaching, we're talking about feedback and reteaching as part of the formative assessment cycle. So it's one thing just to ask the question and take that assessment, right? It's another thing to do something with the information that formative assessment give us. And that's what we're trying to capture within that, that mouthful of words around rigor. So that is the gist of our definition of rigor, and why it's important for us today, especially as we think about small groups in distance learning, rather, teaching and learning is what I was trying to say, not Turkey. is the last portion of the definition, and have the opportunity for reteaching to mastery. So again, we'll ask you to stop and jot for just a moment, whether it's again it's on scratch paper or just keep some thinking in your heads. What are some common strategies for providing reteaching opportunities to students that need additional support to achieve proficiency? Take a moment to think about that. And in this setting, you might be identifying things like individual tutoring, whether that's before or after class, or pulling students up to your desk while, while socially distant, I suppose, as the case might be. You might be thinking about asynchronous sessions where you have only one or two students meeting, or asynchronous meeting times rather. You have one or two students meeting with you in a small group to do some of that work. You might have more formalized small group structures in your class in mind, or you might have some outside tutoring sources like a Khan Academy or Edgenuity or something of the sort to provide some enrichment and remediation that way, as the case might be. So all of those are possibilities. All of those are fairly common and are within most educators' repertoire. But as promised in today's title and all the promotion you saw coming up to it, we wanted to really focus in on that small group supports that we can provide during distance learning here. So when thinking about small group instruction and what that overall design looks like, we're going to think about that in with 4 of the 5 W's in 3 large groups. We're going to focus on logistics when we think about the when and where of what that small group work might look like. We're going to talk about how we might form those groups. So who is the membership of those groups that we're asking to either work together on something or that we are otherwise supporting through our intervention and reteaching work. And we're also going to talk about planning or executing in the groups. So how does that intervention work look? What do I need to do as a teacher? What do I need to plan for in order to support those students who are either ready for a challenge and ready to move forward, who are right on grade level and right where I need them to be, or who might need a little support to get them where I need to be. So that's kind of the broad framework of our discussion here, the logistics, the forming groups, and planning, the executing in groups. And that's what we'll move forward to here. So our first question we wanted to attend to on the logistics side is the when. We know that many of you in distance learning settings your schedules kind of mimic a school day, where the kids at the secondary level, your kids are moving from period to period to period, much as they would in the classroom, whether that's for short and 20-minute blocks, or we've had some partners and heard of some schools doing 90-minute blocks of a variety of synchronous or asynchronous works, but there's still that school day structure there, right? In elementary settings, you might have a school day structure that kind of mimics what you might have done with a ELA block, a social studies block, a science block throughout your day, and small group time as well. And there's a lot of value in holding to those school day schedules, because they can provide a lot of structure and a lot of familiarity, especially in this uncertain times we find ourselves in. So at the secondary level, as far as to help answer the question of when can we do small group work, if you have multiple class meetings throughout a week, consider devoting one of those class meetings to a small group session where you are providing some intensive support and enrichment as necessary. At the elementary level, you likely already have small groups as part of your instruction routine, just as you do or did in face-to-face instruction, whether that is small group reading or small group math practice. So you might be kind of well versed in some of the when, but we can talk differently about some of the how as we go a little bit later into the session here. We know that some of our partners have more flexible schedules as well, where they're not trying to necessarily mimic the school day and really give teachers a lot of voice and choice in how their workday looks, whether that is through office hours, whether that's through tutoring, enrichment periods, or so on and so forth. And so we'd highly encourage you, for those of you who have more flexible schedules, to think about those asynchronous times like office hours or those tutoring periods or asynchronous work periods, whatever they may be labeled in your district, to really use that to schedule time to come together with your groups of students who might need extra support from you or who might need some enrichment or just additional practice from you as well. So the when is whenever it's convenient, but those are some options that you might want to consider, whether that's part of your school day as the routine you already have working for you, or leveraging some of those other times that aren't as spoken for in your more flexible schedules. I also been thinking about the when. We know that, and this kind of bleeds into the who a little bit as well, but we know that caregivers for the for students who are at home are part of the consideration here as well. So where we might have more flexible, more dynamic grouping that happens, especially at the elementary level, where we might have different kids in different groups from day to day, or so on and so forth, we recommend that where we can, we have more consistent groupings for a period of time, whether that's a period of 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, to give caregivers some time to adjust to whatever the scheduling demands might mean or might be in the scenario that you're proposing to them. So it's definitely in distance learning. That's one thing to keep track of is how do the supports we offer to kids really impact their caregivers' ability to help them access those supports.
Right. And Randy, as you said, this isn't saying that they should be the same group all year long, just that flexible grouping instead of that daily or weekly that we may be able to do while we're in school. For those of you who are still virtual or blended, it might mean that we have those flexible groups a little bit longer, but still based on the needs of the kids so that we can still really focus in on what we're asking them to do to help support them.
Thank you. So let's next talk about the where. And if you are distance learning, the where hopefully is fairly straightforward, but whatever adapted video conference software your school or institution has adopted. We know that especially for schools who are have a more school day-esque schedule where students move from period to period to period, we know that along with that often comes a mandate that all students are online for that entire period for the same time. So in those cases, we encourage you to think about using breakout rooms. But of course, the pushback or the concern is that, well, wait a minute, what do the kids do who aren't in the breakout room with me? Well, the same thing they do, hopefully in the classroom when they're not with you as well, right? There's certainly you can still observe them in breakout rooms. That's accomplished through having recordings of those individual sessions for you to observe. But that's also, whether you're in person or in a breakout room, that's also requiring some evidence of the work, right? By the end of these next 20 minutes, I expect everyone to have turned in XYZ artifact of their work or of their thinking, or be ready to talk about this reading or so on and so forth. So no matter your setting, whether you are in person or using breakout rooms to offer these small group supports, thinking about how you can monitor students is important, but also think as they're doing the work is important, but also lending an ear and some consideration to that evidence of their thinking is key too.
Great. Andy, someone had mentioned that, along with the breakout rooms, that what they do in order to get around that, because they have middle schoolers, is the idea of every student has their own breakout room. So if you have 20 kids, 25 kids, you have 25 breakout rooms, and then you have a small group. So like if you're going to bring 5 kids together because they're the ones that really need that extra support, that's a small group breakout room because you're there, but everybody else has their own individual breakout room. And that way they in and out as they want. They can have individual student conferences. So I thought that was a great idea.
Yeah, that's another excellent way to think about that, right? So you don't necessarily have 20 kids unattended in one big breakout room and you with your small group of 5 students who might need extra support or enrichment in the other room. So definitely divide and conquer can be a viable strategy here as you're thinking about planning these opportunities. So as we've talked about these first 2 questions, the when and where, we want to give you a chance to reflect on those. What might that might mean for your practice? So please take a few moments to think about this question. Given your unique situation and all technology limitations or not limitations that you have, or your mix of hybrid or virtual or face-to-face learning, what are some possible answers to the questions of when and where of small group instruction for you? Your answers probably look a lot like what we talked about in terms of, well, they could happen in my classroom or they happen with video conferencing, but it's still important that they're your answers, right? That you've started some of the thinking here along this process. So we'll have several stops throughout today's session where you have a chance to kind of reflect and start thinking about what your own plan might look like for small group instruction. So we'll keep that piece of paper handy, or keep those thoughts handy up there, so you can come back to them and refer to them and kind of build on this plan as we go forward. So the next consideration when we talk about forming groups is the who. And we would strongly suggest, because we cannot demand it of you, that you have data guided group membership here. So what does that mean? Well, we can triangulate that group membership based on standardized assessments, whether that's NWEA, Ed Performance, or whatever state assessment data you might have available. Classroom assessments certainly have a role to play in how we group students, and that will become even more apparent as we talk about some of the examples a little bit later on. But there might also be observation data that we gather as experts in the field, experts on children, that we have on hand as well. That can be helpful in informing how we want to structure those groups. In general, though, for this purpose, we want to have homogeneous groups with similar skill levels and similar traits, because the purpose of this grouping is for remediation and or enrichment, right? There are lots of cases where we might have more heterogeneous groups, more mixed ability groupings. But as we'll ask you to reflect on in a minute, but that may not be most appropriate kind of grouping for the work we want to do here within these particular small groups for interventions and for enrichment. So as I said, that's what we'll reflect on here for a moment. So we know that small groups can be formed on a heterogeneous basis or a homogeneous basis. So whether we have kids with similar traits or kids with different traits, achievement levels or achievement profiles in a grouping. How might the purpose of a small group learning activity affect our decision-making in that area? So please take a moment to reflect on that question. So as we talked about on the previous slide, you might be thinking of more homogeneous groups when you're thinking about these intervention or enrichment groups. Heterogeneous groups tend to, sorry, you might be thinking about, no, I had that right. You might be thinking about heterogeneous groups if you are thinking more along maybe something for new learning or some collaboration or review that where you might have some decisions to be made around that, right? So the group composition can be dictated by what we want those groups to do. And that is a helpful thing to remember, especially as we're planning some of this small group work.
And Randy, as someone has pointed, homogeneous groups are still not really homogeneous because we have so much of a spectrum and a variety in our classrooms, no matter how big or small they are. But it's that idea of having a like group, if you will, kind of taking that spectrum and chopping it into a couple of different parameters so that we can get kids that have a bit more of the same need in the same grouping so that we can really help focus and support them.
Thank you. That is a great point to point out, or a great point to address as well. And that there's a lot of things that make us different as people. So when we're talking about a lot of the differentiation grouping we are going forward here throughout the session, we are going to be focusing on those like kind of achievement levels or achievement bands or profiles as we move forward here. So let's talk a little bit about the how. How do I do this as a teacher? How do I make this work for me? And so we have fun. We find it helpful, as we've alluded to throughout the presentation, to think about our students in 3 distinct lanes or 3 distinct groups. And when we say groups, that doesn't necessarily mean that these are small groups that are working together on some collaborative task. It does mean, though, that they are 3 broad groups of students that have a different need from us at a different time. So we'll start by talking about those students who we could characterize as needing some extra support. Perhaps on a recent checkpoint or a recent capstone or assessment, they didn't quite cut the mustard. There's some growth they can do in order to meet those proficiency targets that you have so thoughtfully crafted and laid out for them. And they're just not there yet. So in generally, what are some things we can do to help support those students? Well, we know we need to determine some alternate explanations, modeling, and activities to engage those students. If they didn't get it the first time, repeating the same sort of instruction again is probably not going to be that helpful to them. So if there is another example we can bring in, or someone else is thinking, maybe turning to some of those outside sources for a video or something else around the same concept, or different types of practice opportunities and explanations, maybe switching the modes of instruction from a lecture to a video, or from a lecture to a reading to help students internalize that. That is one thing that certainly can support those students. Secondly, we know that they'll need some additional practice problems or a question or a prompt or a question to consider to really use that skill and practice that skill, whatever that target skill is that we are focusing on. But we also know that for this group in particular to grow, they're going to need some just-in-time feedback. Chances are, if they aren't there just yet, they aren't hitting the proficient targets, there's some misconceptions or some knowledge gaps that they're having, and waiting to provide that feedback, especially for this group, can be a misstep on our parts. So in these times when we're having the small group work, these students need just-in-time both affirming feedback. Yes, you're on the right track. Please keep doing that. Please keep thinking like that. That's great work. And adjusting feedback, saying, let's think about that another way, or here's another way we can think about solving that problem. Not to devalue the importance of feedback for other students, but especially when we think about that timeliness component of feedback, it is key for this group of students that we are thinking about here. The second group of students we want to consider are the students that are on target. They hit our proficiency targets right on the mark. They got that 75% on the capstone assessment, or the 80%, or whatever you decide that threshold was, because you carefully considered that. In this small group time, or the small group practice, they might need a small amount of additional practice, right? Practice doesn't make perfect, right? Perfect practice makes perfect. And that helps them to internalize those good behaviors and good thought patterns and good practices that they already have. So if we can give them a small amount of additional practice that reinforces that current content that they're working on, or if we can ask them to make some connections between previous content and the current content, or make some predictions about new content, those are all good things for them to consider. They also need just-in-time affirming and adjusting feedback. But if we were to triage our feedback concerns, they're number 2 here on our slot. Our first, the students we want to come to first are the students with those big and lingering misconceptions that led to them falling short of our proficiency targets. In this case, we still want to keep our eye on this group of students, the students that are on target, because we don't want them to make missteps, right? We want to make sure that the success that they had wasn't an accident, so to speak. We want to make sure we can support them and continue to be successful in accomplishing the specific learning target. And finally, our third grouping of students we'll talk about is the students that are ready for a challenge. So these are students who can benefit from practice to reinforce the new content. So they might be working on some deeper tasks. They might assume an alternate viewpoint. So if we just talked about the War of 1812 in our US history class, they might then want to explore that same conflict through the eyes of the British, and look at some differing attitudes that might happen around that. So not necessarily a more work, right? Just different work, more complex work for them to engage with. And we might ask them to engage with an alternate presentation format. So if we're asking a lot of our students to work on a a paper or a brief presentation to make their information public, we might want to think about some alternate ways for them to apply their knowledge, especially for students who have an interest in exploring some of those technology, the variety of technological options available to them. And we also want to think about opportunities for those students to perform some independent research as well, particularly if they are showing that they're ready for a challenge. They blew our proficiency targets away. They are above and beyond where we expected them to be. That might indicate that this is a high interest topic or a high interest skill for them. So if we can work with them and partner with them to design some independent research opportunities to really foster that love and foster that need, what a powerful organic learning experience for them. Anissa.
Randy, and I was just thinking back to my own kids, as well as like thinking about some that I've talked with in science, especially, and that idea of that independent research can come in really handy for those kids that just have a natural capacity for science. They're really on top of it. They're ready for that challenge. We don't want them necessarily to move forward and get ahead of the rest of the class, but they're typically the ones that may be asking, or at least for this particular section of our curriculum, they're asking those questions. And so this is a great time to turn those questions into a independent research activity for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's a key point that we would be remiss if we didn't highlight here. Students that are ready for a challenge aren't necessarily ready to move forward in their curriculum because, as you might envision, that can create a lot of different headaches for you as a teacher, right? If you have one group that is perpetually a step ahead of the bulk of your class. So that doesn't mean that they're necessarily moving on to new topics, right? They're moving on to a deeper exploration of a topic or going off on these tangents. Tangent is is perhaps the right word, but they're going on these deeper explorations of some topics to really build their own knowledge and build their own capacity, but not at the expense of the teacher's sanity, right? In terms of maintaining a guaranteed and viable curriculum for the course.
Right. And the other thing, Ray, to keep in mind is something that we've, as educators, especially, last year and this year and the next year, are really going to be struggling with is that identifying those most powerful standards and skills that every kid is supposed to have, right? So our curriculum may be a bit truncated than it has been in the past, which is a really frustrating thing because we're like, but everything's important. But as we're trying to think about that, and we know that we've had to truncate and we've had to kind of consolidate our a bit for those kids that are ready for a challenge, that independent research might be some of those pieces that we weren't able to put in this year. Some of those parts that may naturally be a part of our curriculum in general, but can't be right now because they're just not the most important critical thing for all kids to know or be able to do, but is a good enrichment for the kids that are ready and are able to take that on.
Thank you. And of course, these students need feedback as well, especially perhaps if we're thinking about the triage that we talked about in the last two slides. If they're performing independent research, they might need some dedicated attention in terms of guiding that research, especially if they are novices to those that expectation, novices to that. If they are, however, working on alternate tasks or alternate viewpoints, they may already be proficient with the skill that they're working on, right? If they were to instead explore an issue from an alternate viewpoint, they already know how to research, they already know how to write whatever it is that we might be asking them to write. So they still need feedback, but in terms of where we're spending our time and what we're prioritizing, though the other two groups may come first in this particular level. But again, it depends on the particular enrichment task or the enrichment activity we've devised for these children. So let's think a bit about what that looks like in a practical sense. What does it mean to plan a lesson where we have these three distinct groupings? While you may not be able to read all this print here, we want to give you an overview of a social studies lesson and get inside the head rather of a social studies teacher who might be planning a lesson or planning some instruction around the Harlem Renaissance in a few different contexts. So we're going to start first by talking about what this looks like and what it takes to get small group instruction done in a face-to-face setting. So previously speaking, we might have been, we have just given a checkpoint. We know that some of our students, about a quarter to 50% of them, may not have hit that proficiency targets. And that tells us that they might need some reteaching on that previous concept. While the remainder of our students, that 50 to 75% who did hit those proficiency targets, are ready to move on. As we think about this lesson going on the left side, there's a few key components of the lesson cycle that we want to highlight. We think about, of course, the hook, the new learning, the guided practice, the independent practice, and the closure. As we look at how this lesson is designed, and we look across the top columns where we're talking about the time and stage of learning cycle, the student work expected, the description of the activity, and the check for understanding, we notice a few things just from the way that the table and the design is laid out. We know that hook, the new learning, and the guided practice for this lesson are all happening concurrently, right? They're all happening as part of from the opening of class. Students are asked to first respond to that picture inductive model during the hook and have some conversation there. The new learning from the teacher, the mini lecture, all happens the same, and students are then asked to do a little bit of whiteboard review around that. There's a little guided practice then where the teacher offers some instruction, how reading strategy, question chunk, annotate, around a Langston Hughes short story about the ways of white folks. And the teacher, again, is modeling and walking around and observing that students are on their way toward mastery of that skill during guided practice. But you'll see where the three paths diverge then is in that independent practice and some different, the different independent practice opportunities that the teacher has provided and devised for students here. Going from left to right, for our students ready for a challenge, they're working with a more complex text as they practice the question chunk annotate strategy independently. They're working with Will V-Day Be Me Day Too, another poem from the Harlem Renaissance era. For students who are on target, they're working with an on grade level text. They're looking at Mother and Child, which is a more on level text from this era. But for students needing extra support, these are the ones that are going to need some one-to-one FaceTime with the teacher, whether that is all of them back at a table or the teacher individually supporting students as time and space allows. So they might be going through a read aloud here, where they're facilitating some window pane note taking, and then asking students within that small group to continue that window pane note taking to really pull out some of the main ideas of each session or each element of the article there. Students are then asked to complete that window pane note taking to make sure they have some understanding of the events from the prior checkpoint, which is outlined in the previous I can noted on our left. I can investigate historical development of major scientific and technological innovations on culture and thought. And the way the teacher checks for understanding there is by asking students in that small group to engage in a think, pair, share. How might Carver's work have influenced culture and thoughts during this time? And based on the responses that they're given in the small group, students can then be released to complete the on-level work, whether that is for additional on practice time at home, or thinking about some rolling deadlines to account for the time that these students needed that extra support from the teacher. But we noticed that no matter what you're working on that day, the closure is the same for all groups. In what ways do those pieces challenge the status quo of the time? And having a sort of text agnostic closure in that case is really helpful for preserving some student integrity, some student dignity, right? Nobody necessarily wants to be called out for being the students who need extra support. And certainly some of the students ready for a challenge don't necessarily want to be singled out for that reason either. By asking that open-ended closure question, asking students to react to how their individual piece that they worked on during that instructional period might have challenged the status quo of the time can be really helpful in ensuring that all students have access and the ability to participate in that conversation at the end of the lesson period. In the next scenario, we'll think more about what that happens, what that looks like in a blended context. And blended in this case, we're talking about students being at home sometime and in person some of the time, in person in your classroom some of the time. So you might be calling that a hybrid or a mixed model or whatever unique vernacular applies to your school, but just to make sure we're all on the same page here. The setup is much the same. The key difference though is what is shaded in blue is work that is done asynchronously. It's work that's done, or rather work that is done at home. Not necessarily asynchronously as pointed out in the hook, because we wanted to, we designed that hook to be synchronous because we want to get students talking, want to get students engaged with getting into the content matter here and making some predictions about Harlem Renaissance culture. The new learning and the guided practice both happen independently. They happen before students come to class that week. But students are again submitting some evidence of that work. So that's all that first, but all students are again responsible for the same amount of work and the same types of learning activities in those first 3 stages of the learning cycle. Where it differs, again, is when students come to you for that independent practice in that face-to-face setting in the school building. In this case, the activities outlined here very much mirror what's provided for us or what the teacher thought about in the first context or in the first setting where we were purely face-to-face. And the closure is done inside that class period as well. Some of the thinking behind the structure is that a lot of that independent work, that new learning, the guided practice, can be done and checked for understanding, kind of asynchronously, that we can provide feedback to students as that learning goes. But if we had to value what time was and activities were most important to get done in the classroom, is that independent practice time. So we can provide some just-in-time feedback to all of our kids who might need it, no matter what grouping they are in.
And Randy, I just wanted to point out, somebody had asked, is this something that is a daily occurrence? And no, we go back to one of your previous slides that it talked about the when, depending on what grade level you're at and what the needs are, this is based on some data that we have. So assessment that we may have given very recently, but it's not that idea that we are doing this basis, because that's just not feasible. This is instead thinking about, okay, I've given the kids this formal assessment. I know where they're at. I know who's struggled. I know who's ready to move on and so forth. And then thinking about what day of the week, or if it's blended, like Randy's example right here, it's like, when do I actually get to see them in person? That's when I'm going to do this. So that for those kids that are needing extra support on this lesson plan, I can do the read aloud with them. I can literally be with them as so close as we are allowed to be in our masks. And so I think that's something really key and critical to keep in mind, is that this requires our thoughts ahead of time, right? This requires our thinking about what is it that I want each of these groups of kids, groupings of kids to do. And so it's not something that we can just pull out of our hat on a daily basis, but instead it's something that we really, really strategically and intentionally think about and plan days ahead, so that this activity can be pulled off basically. But yeah, so.
That's a great point, right? And that clearly this sort of lesson plan, like any lesson plan, requires some preparation. And lesson plans like these, perhaps even more so. However, there is a point to be made to consider timeliness. We don't must, especially if we're offering remediation for a checkpoint that students recently took. We don't want that feedback and that reteaching to happen so far away from the original event where the reteaching, if you will, it might as well be new teaching at that point. So this isn't something where we collect the data and take 3 weeks and then sit and say, maybe we need to do some reteaching. It's within a few days of having taken that checkpoint, so we can provide feedback and extra support to the kids who need it as soon as is practical. As we think about the last scenario, which many of our partners have found ourselves in for much of the year, what do we do when it's purely remote? The first 3 rows, first 4 rows, because the first row is headers. So hook, new learning, guided practice are the same as they were in the previous on the previous slide, where there's a lot of work that students can do independently. Independent practice in a purely remote setting might look a little bit different though, depending on how your school day is structured or how your asynchronous and asynchronous times are structured. In many cases, for your students ready for a challenge and for students on target, they may be able to complete that work independently, and you may not need to see them, but they do need to submit copies of their work for that accountability piece, so we can give them some feedback on their thinking. So the only group we may call in for a synchronous meeting during the independent practice period is that group who needs some additional support. Conversely, though, if you're in more typical or school day-like structure, a structure that parallels the school day, well, of course, then you'll have your students, all of your school students online, and in breakout rooms, and this may be a good opportunity for students to be in their individual breakout rooms, as Anissa talked about earlier, or to have three breakout rooms where students could lean on each other for mutual support for the students ready for a challenge, on target, or needing extra support. But again, the exit ticket doesn't change either. It's still an opportunity to reflect on the individual reading that you worked on at that point, and still an opportunity to contribute to the conversation, no matter what piece or pieces you worked with a little bit earlier in the session.
And Randy, something that somebody just brought forward, that idea of the 3 columns, right, for students on target needing extra support, those aren't necessarily equal numbers, right? Because it really is based on the data. So in this case, as you had mentioned at the very beginning, it could be like a quarter, or maybe 5 to 7 of our kids weren't doing well on that last formal assessment that we gave. And so those are the ones that we're working at very specifically and have much more hands-on involvement with, whereas the other kids, we get them started and then they're on their own. And as Randy had said, they may be supporting each other, but they don't have anywhere near as much formal action from us. And so as we look at that that chart for the independent practice, that's really helping to lay that out. It's like, okay, if I've got these 3 groupings, right, not necessarily 3 groups, but 3 groupings of kids, one of them is going to require more attention than the others. And so really thinking intentionally about what is the role that I need to play, those will really help us to say, okay, what help can I give to those kids that are needing extra support at this time? And then what can I give the kids to do that's more independent?
Mm-hmm. And that's one thing we were very intentional about when we talk about this template, and to talk about this this thought process with our partners, is that teacher role and actions, the first part of the subtable, if you will, under independent practice. What do I need to offer these kids at this point in time? So thank you for highlighting that. That's a great opportunity for you to highlight that thinking, as you being the audience, to highlight that thinking as you are thinking about how to support your kids as well.
Yeah, because if you find out that you have a very active role in all 3 columns, then it's time to rethink a little bit about what are those activities that I want the other groupings of kids to do at this time. I could change it later, but like, I want them to do it this time so I can really focus on one of the groups at a time.
You can't be everywhere, no matter how much you'd like to. So to help kind of bring this all together into some of this discussion, consider a recent assessment which revealed learning gaps for some of your students. What activities might be helpful in addressing those gaps? And again, think about how much you as the instructor may need to be involved in some of those activities as well. So you might have thought about small group read alouds. You might have thought about more independent practice. You might have thought about lectures or videos or supplemental online resources. One kind of blessing in disguise of this whole distance learning thing is that we have found a plethora of online resources we might use to supplement instruction, but we really do have to be intentional about which ones we employ and for what reasons. But certainly we want to think about as activities that students can do more independently versus activities that we need to play a more active role in as we think about providing these interventions for our students. So to tie that up into a neat little bow, we've talked about a few key questions today to help guide our small group instruction during distance learning. We talked about logistics, and we talked about when will these small groups meet and where will they meet, depending on the mode of instruction that we find ourselves in. We talked about forming groups. So who do we put in these groups, and what should that membership look like? And we talked a bit about in the last few minutes about planning or executing those groups. How does that teaching look rather when you're in those settings? So we know that's a lot of information, especially as you think about the template. So we want to give you a few moments then to sketch a possible workflow for developing small group lessons for your learners. Thinking about those 3 lanes, how does that look? How will you plan that out? What steps do you need to take in order to get that done? Take a few moments to sketch your own personal workflow here before we get ready to close out our time together. All right, we will open the floor now for any Q&A that we might have. I don't see any hands raised with that feature, but Anissa, I know you've been tracking some of the chat as we go forward. Or as we've gone forward throughout the session, what are some things you're seeing or have seen from folks?
So one big question is, how do I communicate with my kids that it's not just busy work, especially if passed the assessment and they're doing okie dokie. So any ideas you have, and then I have 1 or 2.
Okay. I think one way to frame that, right, is thinking a little bit about the idea of practice, right? Especially when our ICANs, if we were to go back to some of the examples, they're very much skills based. I can identify these patterns, or I can identify with the way this contributed to this historical feature or figure contributed to the development of culture, right? And these particular examples. So when we're thinking about practice and those skills, framing that additional work as practice. You know, you did well here, but especially with a lot of these ICANs, they're going to come up again, and we're going to come up again. So that additional practice opportunity. Making sure that success is purposeful and intentional, and you know what you did to be successful, and you reflect on the practice, can be a way to frame that and get students really invested in that work, where you as the teacher may have a less hands-on role during the independent practice time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was just thinking that, motivation is different for different kids because they've got a different variety of things that they're interested in. But just taking one example for some of our kiddos that may be more of the sports oriented, the best athletes, they still practice. He isn't just, eating bonbons on the sidelines during practice. He's still practicing, and that's why he's still really, as good as he is. And, Drew Brees, of course, does that as well. So I think that's part of it is you had mentioned, perfect practice makes perfect, right? It's not just practice in general. And that idea that all of us need to continue to practice in order to stay at the level that we're at and not to slip backwards. So sometimes that really helps with the kids, and whether that's a sports or a music analogy, just thinking about your own kids and what some of their interests might be, having a couple of examples like that to just kind of reiterate the fact that this is not just work to keep you busy while, other kids are doing something else. It's really that everybody's doing something that either reinforces, as you said, Randy, or help, that independent research, trying to get into that, answer their own questions type of thing. So either, it's just practicing those skills that they're going to need over and over again.
Mm-hmm. But the key thread, or the common thread between both of our answers, is framing it as practice, right? This isn't busy work. This isn't something just to keep you busy. It is something to help you hone the muscles in your head.
Yeah. Well, and Randy, just to think about that, we have a lot of teachers that call it practice workshop. Some schools have reading workshop, writing workshop, whatever, but it's that workshop, and that just kind of reinforces and helps to frame it as everybody's doing some kind of practice. We may not all be doing the same practice, but we're all doing something to help support ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Are there any other lingering questions that we have not attended to throughout? Okay. Well, we are near the end of our time together. It is 4:25. We're going to try to give you a few minutes of your day back. Before we wrap up today, though, we do have a few things to offer in to help us close our session. First, we're always interested in knowing more about how we have done. So as soon as we turn off the recording here and we say bye-bye for now, a feedback survey will pop up for you. So you can let us know about your experience today. Part of that feedback survey is it will ask you for an exit ticket to help you reflect a little bit further and give us some more information about what's on your mind as a result of your learning today. So we want to ask you to think about this exit ticket. What are some barriers that might stand in the way of implementing small group instruction during distance learning, and how might you overcome them? They don't need to be perfect responses, just want to know what's the top of mind for you right now, and that will help inform us as we think about future webinars or we reach out to you to help engage in some collective problem solving around whatever issues that is you might be facing. So with all that said, we'll give you a few minutes back of your afternoon. It's been a little slice of heaven. Thank you for spending your time with us. You could have spent your Tuesday afternoon anyway, but you chose to spend it here, and we thank you for that. I'll turn it over to Nissa for any parting words she has to say. And then after that, we'll end the broadcast for today, and that feedback survey will pop up for you.
All right, thanks, Randy. I think the parting words that I have, the parting wisdom, is that idea that for those of you that may be like having a little panic attack and going, okay, possibly write that kind of lesson plan. Again, as we said, it's not like on a daily basis, but it's that idea that the more forward thinking we are, the less work we're going to have to do on the back end. So just thinking about what is it that is going to get my kids to where I want them to be, what is going to be the most reinforcing for them. And so that way, when I've got them in front of me, whether that's on the screen or whether it's in person, it goes as smoothly as possible. And I'm not going to have to do more just that idea of trying to do a little front loading on our end in the thinking so that it all comes off without a hitch. That's the goal.
Okay. Well, we thank you all for your time and attention today. We will hopefully hear from you all soon. Again, as soon as we close out and end the broadcast here, that feedback survey will pop up for you. Please let us know how we did today, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.